Hi, and welcome to the third video in this series. In the first video about groups, we talked about how and why you might start to consider using groups to build community, to create support nets, to really help people connect with other people and other things that are relevant to them. In video 2, we talked about how to either build a group from scratch or if you're given a group, how to adopt that group and deal with the settings, the configuration, some of the things that you might want to put there. In this video, in group 3, we're going to talk a little bit about how to manage a group, how to facilitate or moderate, what are some of the best practices associated with groups in this environment. I want to point out very quickly that as people come into the groups and as they see stuff, one of the biggest concerns that we hear when people first start to use the system is, won't students be overwhelmed or won't students be underwhelmed? People are concerned that there's going to be too much activity or that there's going to be too little activity. Keep in mind that most of our partners, after a period of time, 2, 3, 4 months, they realize that that fear is unnecessary, because there is a fairly standard and systematic clip of things that happen in a regular cadence as things go inside of groups that people are in, as well as from the other kinds of posts that are made, things like events that have been uploaded, new pages that have been added to people's menus, new tools that have been added to people's menus. There is plenty of things to pepper the activity feed with updates and things that are relevant. But at the same time, most people are in groups that are so relevant to them that they don't consider the conversations taking place in those groups to be overwhelming. And again, remember, the conversations themselves, which show up in the activity feed, do not translate to the notifications area. That's just the most important stuff in the system: the notifications, the announcements, and that includes posts made only by a person who's an administrator in a group. So with that said, let's start to talk a little bit about what some of those effective practices are to really help guide you, at least at the start, as you start thinking about the process of moderating and facilitating in these group areas. I do want to remind you, once again, we have given you some other sources of information. There's the sample slides that show just different ways that schools have used groups inside of their environments. They've just been replicated in pictorial form on these pages. There are some communication templates that you might be able to use if you're calling people to showcases or trainings. But I really want to point out now, just for this particular video, the information about change management, because it directly impacts the conversation that we're having now about how to best facilitate and moderate. Now, obviously, these practices are effective practices. It would be disingenuous to call them best practices, because every constituent group, every school, every institution, every usage of our system is a little bit different. You've got different needs, different kinds of people, and those sorts of things. There are a couple things, though, that we try to showcase here that really are to your benefit. First of all, we do recommend that you have some kind of oversight documentation that we label a style guide, but you may call any other number of governance forms that start to speak to the kinds of banners that people can choose to go into groups, the kinds of avatars that they might consider using in this little section right over here. What is appropriate? Perhaps the school wants to give some choices that people can only choose from. Perhaps they just want to give guidance around what kind of choices to make. Or perhaps they say it's really up to the group owner, you can use whatever you want. Obviously, all of those things are possible, but your institution might have an appetite for one versus another kind of choice. At the same time, there really is some benefit to having a team or an oversight group that pays attention to what's going on inside of the system. And that includes how much chatter, how much communication, how much activity is actually taking place on a regular basis. So having some sort of strategic advisory group like this really can start to say things like this: you know what, if a group goes dormant or stagnant, if there's no new posts made, if there's no conversation taking place over the course of, say, 3 months, then we're going to archive that group at that point, or we're at least going to reach out to the group owners and ask what's going on. Maybe for you, that the appetite for that is at once every semester, once every 6 months, once a year, who knows. But having an organization or a group of people that help with those decisions and with the creation of documentation around those decisions really can be quite beneficial. At the same time, there are some different suggestions in here about how to increase usage, not just of the entire system itself of campus, but also of the community-facing areas, of the groups, of the discussions, of the conversations, of the resources, of the things that are taking place in that group umbrella to generate and build community. There are some recommendations here for doing that. One of those recommendations I like very much. It's the concept of an ambassador program. So, for example, perhaps in your department, you've got a couple of work studies, maybe 1, maybe 3, maybe 5. Perhaps you ask that when they come in, that they spend a portion of their time, maybe it's 30 minutes, maybe it's 15 minutes, maybe it's an hour, going through your group that you're managing, your department's group or the groups that are within your purview, and just looking to make sure that people who have asked questions have had those questions answered, that they're getting relevant information. Or maybe beyond just that, you're asking them to act as influencers. In other words, you're saying, please go through our group's pages, and if you see something that is an obvious connection point that the poster has not made, make that connection for them. Say, hey, I noticed your post. Have you connected with this other person? Or have you looked at this professor who's doing this research about this stuff? Or have you looked at this other group or this page of content that might answer your questions? So you can actually get some of your students to act as facilitators, in other words, or connectors back to other parts of the system. At the same time, they might be able to come in and say, wow, that's a really important question that probably should be answered by the department admin or by one of the group admins or a chair or a dean or something like that, and they could facilitate that transaction process. So having ambassadors that do that is really a really good idea, especially because it helps connect the institution even more. It helps connect the group to the greater institution. It helps connect people to people. It really is a nice connectivity option. That is described in some detail here in this change management documentation. And notice that as we talk about all these things, we're always trying to involve the students as often as we can. So if you have groups that are student life groups, maybe you've got something like student government, you want to make these same recommendations to students as they start to consider, how am I going to facilitate or moderate my pages, my groups? How am I going to work with people in this environment? This is a place and a way to really start to give them some help and some assistance. Speaking of help and assistance, let me make a recommendation that we touched on in the second video. It's about pinning posts. As with all things, you probably want to have a pinned post at most times in a group, because it's something that's really important. It almost acts like an announcement, if you will. So not only will it show up in a person's activity feed, it will show up in their notification bell, but it also is the top post in a discussion. Our recommendation is that you have one of those at most times in most groups, but that of course requires a person to remember that things have been posted there. So going back to our dormant or stagnant discussion, if a person posts something as a pin and they leave it for a year, well, I don't know that you can argue that it was really that important if it's supposed to be there all the time. If it's really that important, put it in the info section of your group area and save the pinned post for things that really should be relevant for maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks, maybe a month, but probably not much more than that. At the same time, you want to consider how often you get in and add to the discussion. Now, keep in mind, we talked about in the first video how we can ingest your FAQs. I believe the example I used was, what is financial aid? So that FAQ is already in here. You can see the posted answer. That's great. And we have the ability to monitor for keywords. So if you've got a keyword like I and register. That can send a notification to the registrar's office as one example, or to whomever. But beyond that, how often do you want to get in here and communicate with people, especially as a group administrator, as the owner of a group? Well, our recommendation is that you really take some cues from social media out in the world. If you look at pages that are constantly added to, you can see this in LinkedIn, you can see this in Facebook, you can see this across Twitter. The places that people go back to are the places where there's some kind of meaningful interaction on a regular basis. Now, that can be certainly every day, but it's not a requirement by any means. But once a week seems to be almost the minimum standard that you want if you're going to be a group owner. Now, again, maybe you've got a group that is saying, hey, in terms of our advising for groups on our campus, we want to require that people get into their discussions at least once a week. And maybe sometimes that's as simple as posting something that says, hey, I hope everybody's having a great week. We'll talk to you next week. But maybe it's also other things that are of more relevance, of more importance, getting in there and actually having conversations with people, exploring the questions that they've asked with a little bit more detail, things like that. Maybe it's saying, hey, this question has come up in so many different kinds of ways. I'm going to take it and treat it as an FAQ, and I'm going to have it ingested in the system, or I'm going to add it as a resource over here so that everybody has quick access to it all the time. So just starting to leverage these pages. Again, as I mentioned in the first video, there are schools that report to us, and this was my experience when I implemented this product at a school, whereby staff originally said, we don't want to monitor these pages all the time. We don't have time for that. It's too much. And by the time that a semester had gone by or 2 semesters had gone by, they were naturally investing time in these pages because it was so much better in terms of getting the word out to people. They didn't have to respond to the same email question 17 times for different students. Instead, they could simply post it once and everybody had the ability to see the question and the answer. And they were able then, if somebody else posted that question without reading through the feed, they could say, hey, please see my answer below. And it was that simple. So it really is a place that can start to take on some real power as an efficiency tool. But before you get there, then maybe the question is, how often do I have to post? Hopefully, this has given you a little bit of direction and a little bit of insight into doing that. Now, remember, as you're making posts in these areas, whether it's a group that is just for fun, like this disc golf group, or it's a group that's really consequential, like the Faculty Senate group or something like that, keep in mind that depending on who you're posting as, we talked about this in the second video, whether you're posting as the group or you're posting as yourself, that also can make a bit of a difference. Because if you post as yourself, it is certainly possible that someone will come up into the messages area and try to message you personally because you're the poster of information and they think therefore they want to ask you a private question. Whereas if you post as the group itself, not as an individual, then there's a greater likelihood that the question that comes in will either be here, or perhaps they will go into the info section and find somebody's website or email address or something like that and go that route. So again, how you answer these questions can make a bit of a difference, whether you're posting as yourself or you're posting as the group itself, to suggest that it sort of has more weight or relevance at that point. At the same time, as you think about the conversations that are happening here, we really do recommend a couple of things in terms of the affective nature of groups. There is absolutely a pragmatic responsibility that students would expect the school to take and use inside of a system like this by having certain types of groups maybe around res life. So if you have dorms, then maybe you have every dorm gets its own page, maybe every floor gets its own page, depending again on the appetite of your RAs and that sort of thing. Same thing if you have an orientation program. You probably want to give freshmen an opportunity to be all together in one group and have conversations that go back and forth around orientation. Maybe you add in here new students who are not freshmen. Maybe you add in international students who are brand new, stuff like that. Those are very pragmatic places to get help and support as you start to generate ideas, information, etc. But don't forget about the power of allowing for things that students want to connect to that are outside of the typical purview of school. Just telling people to connect to a learning community in a class, or telling people just to connect to support mechanisms, that's not terribly connective. If you start to look at the reasons that people drop out, fail out, or transition to other schools as they transfer, 7% of students leave because they're lonely. This is the kind of tool that can really help with that. Even though students are surrounded by people all the time in a face-to-face environment, and virtually they may see a lot of names in their class rosters or even in a tool like this, they may still feel lonely unless you can give them opportunities to connect with things that are important to them. That's why we have the illustrations in this demo campus for things like the disc golf group. Maybe that's something that's of interest to people. At the institution where I was, the disc golf team was actually responsible for creating a group like this. They wanted to do it. And so it was students that managed and led this group. I was an administrator in the group as the sponsor of that group, but I really didn't do very much to facilitate or moderate information here. Instead, the students who were involved came in and talked about when they were going to have practices, when they were going to have tournaments, when they were going to sponsor tag tournaments and things like that. And they would invite the campus community of non-team members, but people who still liked disc golf. They brought everyone there to communicate, to talk, to show videos of holes in one and other things that had gone on that they just thought were really neat and cool. By doing that, people connected to our institution through something that was relevant to them. It wasn't just forcing them to try to connect to a learning community in a class that maybe they did and maybe they didn't care about at the time, or with a professor who maybe they liked, maybe they didn't like at the time, or saying just connect to these very pragmatic support issues at the time. It was saying connect to something that matters to you. And if you don't see something, build it and see if other people then connect with you. So that capability and possibility is really widely available inside of this environment. Again, how often you post to areas like that, ultimately it's up to you. How much of that conversation is support-based versus affective and social, that's also up to you. But we hope that you've seen that you can really begin to facilitate the conversations here, whether you take them into private chats and messages that take place one-on-one, or you allow for everybody to see what those conversations are throughout time. The group area really does generate a tremendous amount of community potential. Now, there are other ways that you can get that too. We'll talk about those in other videos, but we hope that this has been effective for how you're going to start to think about facilitating groups, how you're going to consider moderating. We thank you for your time. Good luck, and as always, good learning.